Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Solutions to the Dropout Crisis. This is Terry Cash with the National Dropout Prevention Center, and I'm here with my co-host and colleague, as always, Marty Duckenfield. And we welcome all of you to this monthly radio webcast brought to you by the National Dropout Prevention Center at Clemson University in partnership with Clemson Radio Productions and the generous support of Penn Foster. We also welcome our newest sponsor, Catapult Learning.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. You know, with all the snow we've had across the country, we are really pleased you've chosen to join us today for this wonderful professional development opportunity. You know, I'm particularly excited about today's program, which is on positive behavioral interventions and supports, PBIS, because as you know, Terry, last year we worked with our colleagues in New Hampshire on a monograph on PBS. It was edited by Joanne Malloy, who's the project coordinator for the Institute on Disability for the University of New Hampshire, and co-edited with Melissa Hawkins, who was a research associate with our staff. So, and I do want to mention you'll hear more about this publication very shortly. But one thing I learned then is that the solution that we're focusing on today is a most valuable one. So we're really delighted to be sharing this topic with today's audience. As always, we want to welcome the new listeners to the broadcast. We've got an excellent program planned and one that we believe every school can benefit from. So I'm eager to get started, and I'm sure you are as well. But first of all, we need to remind our listeners of the materials that are provided on the website for today's program. You will see at the top there a slide presentation. It's, in fact, a PowerPoint in PDF format, which will support today's discussion. Have that open and ready to go. There's a good listing of websites, including the Center on Behavioral Education and Research, which houses the OSEP Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. We have several research articles which are providing the evidence base for PBIS, and there's an excellent 100-page plus publication which is an implementation blueprint and a self-assessment guide, which is authored by our guest, Dr. George Sugai, and put out by the OSEP Technical Assistance Center on PBIS. So, there's one more item there. Did I not mention that? How could I forget? Our publication, edited by Joanne and Melissa on PBIS. So, Terry, it looks like there's some really useful information here for our listeners to turn to at the close of the program.
Yes, this certainly is an excellent compilation of resources, Marty, and today's program is just the first step in learning more about a school-wide PBIS model.
Yeah. You know, Terry, one of the great benefits of these webcasts is that the listeners have the opportunity to engage in discussion with our presenters. And so we invite you who are listening to consider being an active part of the program today. We have two ways you can connect to us. This is a radio call-in show, so we encourage you to call in your questions for our guest. We have a toll-free number. It's 888-539-8859. And for those calling outside the U.S., you know, this has never happened. I wonder if today's the day. But the number is 864-656-4549. You may begin calling in now or any time during the program. We'll put you on hold for a few minutes, but we'll try and get to as many of your questions as we can during the broadcast. You know, as an additional benefit for today's program, now listen to this, if you are a caller, we will send you a free copy of the Center's recent monograph, which I mentioned, Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports in Dropout Prevention. And Eric will get your name and address so we can send it to you. There is also, as I mentioned, a link to it on the resource list as far as ordering it as a publication for yourself. So,
well, also, Marty, and we're excited about this, all our callers are going to have the chance to put their name in a hat for a drawing in May to get a free conference registration to the 2011 National Dropout Prevention Conference in Chicago in October. And this includes all callers for this current school year.
Yes, that hat's getting full as the callers come in, and so be one today. And it is such a good offer, my goodness. So we also, number 2, accept email questions sent to our email address, which is ndpc@clemson.edu. And if you put the word solutions in the subject line, I'll be able to see it. I'm sitting here with the computer on one side of me, and I'm monitoring that. And we'll try to get to as many of those questions also. But really, we're looking forward to all of your calls and questions today.
Well, our topic this month is positive behavioral interventions and supports. And what does PBIS have to do with prevention? Well, with us today from the University of Connecticut is our colleague, Dr. George Sugai, who directs the University of Connecticut Center on Behavioral Education and Research and co-directs the OSEP Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. Dr. Sugai is a national expert on PBIS, and so, George, we're delighted to have you join us today.
It's great. I'm very excited to be here. I'm happy to participate in this conversation.
Well, thank you, George, and we look forward to your comments and the information you'll bring to us. As we know, school-wide PBIS is not a packaged program, but rather a framework or approach that integrates both academic and social behavior outcomes for and I like this, all students. This proven effective strategy for improving success is one that has a strong research base for effectiveness and is truly a solution for dropout. And so we believe that today's program is an extremely important one. So let's begin. And be sure to call us with your questions. And that number again is toll-free, 888-539-8859. And for those calling outside the U.S., 864-656-4549. George, let's turn to your PowerPoint now and learn more about PBIS.
Thank you very much. This is a great opportunity. I appreciate this chance to be able to share a little bit about what's going on in the PBIS world. And let me start off by, before we move away from that first slide, just kind of reference again that the OSEP stands for the Office of Special Education Programs, and actually your tax dollars pay for this Technical Assistance Center. And though you've been very generous about suggesting that George Sugai is, the kind of the director of the center, it's actually a place where we have been able to collect vast kinds of amounts of information about best practice in supporting school climate and prevention logic around dropout preventions. And we have a number of universities involved with us, as well as collaborators from around the country. So what I'm going to do for the next few minutes anyway, as we get started, is share with you a little bit about what we've been able to collect and how that's organized in a way that supports the prevention logic that's been going on here in the Center for Dropout Prevention, as well as looking at what PBIS looks like. So if you go to the next slide, which is the one that has the purpose statement on it, what I'd like to be able to do here, just to give us a place to start, is to tell you a little bit of what I want to try to accomplish. I believe that I have about 25 minutes, and I've also been told that you may interrupt at any time and ask questions, which I would encourage. The slideshow is really here just to serve as a framework for organizing the content, but as some of you who've heard me present before know, it's easy to take us off task. I'd be glad to discuss any topic that you're interested in. But what I was asked to do by Terry and Marty and others is to explain a little bit about what is this thing called school-wide positive behavioral support, and what does it have to do with prevention, in particular dropout prevention. To address that purpose, I want to look at four specific kinds of questions. What is school-wide PBS? A little bit about why and where PBIS came from, and then talk somewhat about the implementation of school-wide PBS as a prevention approach, and then lastly, a little bit about how it operates. So those are the four things I want to try to accomplish as we go through the session, if you will. I also want to indicate to you that the slides are available at the radio site as well as at the Dropout Prevention Center. It's also available at pbis.org, which is the place where much of the material comes from. So where I want to start is basically giving you some things to think about to stimulate some questions, stimulate some discussion, maybe give you some things to think about as we go through this thing of trying to define what PBS is. If you go to the next slide, I think one thing I want to do is to try to clarify a little bit about how the parts make up the whole. For those of you that are newbies to this content, school-wide PBS is really what the label we use for much of the approach that I'm going to define for you. But to understand what school-wide PBS is, I think you have to understand a little bit about where it came from, because it's not an invention that Rob Horner or George Sugai or Tim Lewis put together, but in fact it's a way of organizing what's been already out there. So let me give you the brief history, and then we'll move into the rationale part of it and the definition. The most important thing for you to know to start off with is that at the very top of that slide where it says PBIS 1997, when the reauthorization of IDEA came out, inside the law, there was a requirement for setting up a center for disseminating best practice for supporting kids with emotional behavioral disorders. That center was supposed to be named the Center for Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, which is where PBIS got started. Before that time, there really was no such thing as PBIS, but it became part of the way we do business because of the center. So then somebody says, well, what are its roots? And then if you look to the left side of the slide, you'll see Positive Behavioral Supports, PBS, and you'll also see ABA, which is Applied Behavior Analysis. When we formed the center and got started, one of the things that we were very clear about is that we wanted to have a strong evidence base for making the recommendations we make and also have a strong value system that organizes those practices. Positive behavioral support comes out of some of the early work in the 80s with children and adults with developmental disabilities. And it was this approach to look at person-centered planning, person-first language, making sure that families and kids are recognized. Then we wanted to say, what's the technology that's required? And that's where the behavior analysis comes in. And I'll let you look up that content for yourself. But I wanted you to know that PBIS started with the law that got its roots from this context called PBS as well as applied behavior analysis. To fast forward up to 2011, what you need to be aware of as far as two other important influences was implementation science, which comes out of some of the work that Dean Fixon and Karen Blasey are doing at the University of North Carolina, that talks about how important it is to pay attention to what we do when we're trying to implement those best practices. And the last thing that's influenced PBS is the RTI movement, or response to intervention, which I'll describe a little bit later. But those influences have really shaped what PBS is, and you should be getting the idea that school-wide PBS is not an intervention per se. It's really an approach that organizes these different influences together to try to build school climates that prevent the development of problem behavior, and in this context, dropout prevention as well. So if you shift to the next slide, and what I want to do then is to give you another little spin on the history. And for some of you that know me, my previous history was working with kids with serious emotional behavioral disorders. That's my passion. That's what I did a lot of my early research with. I was a teacher of children with emotional behavioral disorders in Colorado. I love working with kids and families who have these particular kinds of challenges and disabilities. And that's where we started with the center, was how do we support kids with severe behavioral difficulties. Immediately what we learned, though, was that you can't do that very well without paying attention to the larger school-wide features where those interventions are being put in place. And the other items on that particular slide talk about you got to blend this behavior stuff with the academic initiatives that are out there. We've got to pay attention to what the larger climate of the school and classroom looks like if we're going to work well with individual students. We've got to move away from a get tough approach to responding to problem behavior and think more about prevention, which is really what this call is about. And then understanding that everything we do in the school context is about maximizing academic achievement. If later on I know that there's going to be a question about how do we get buy-in and how do we get staff and families to actively participate, one way to think about that is PBS is really about improving academic outcomes as well as behavioral outcomes. So let me switch to the next slide, which is the definition slide. And those of you that are still paying attention, this is probably one of the most important slides that I'm going to cover because it will be on the test. It's the one that's going to tell us a little bit about what is the definition of school-wide PBS. And then I'm going to do a couple other things, and I'll stop and see if there are any questions from either Marty or Terry or if anybody from the listening audience. This slide is the most important. When somebody says to me, what does PBS have to do with public broadcasting? I'm going to say, whoops, we've got a mistake there. PBS is public broadcasting systems, but PBIS is actually not the same. It actually stands for School-Wide Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, also known as School-Wide PBS, as I described earlier. And we want to make sure that we go to the next question that oftentimes comes up, which is, where do I buy PBIS? And our response always is, you can't buy PBIS, you can't buy school-wide PBS. What you need to understand that school-wide PBS is actually a framework, or it's an approach. It's a model for doing business. Somebody says then, well, what is that business that you all do in school-wide PBS? Our response is, we're in the business of helping schools identify the best evidence-based interventions and organizing them along a continuum for all kids to individual students. Why do we do that? Because we really want to maximize both academic and behavioral outcomes. And it's not for individual students, it's for all kids inside a school. Kids with disabilities, kids without disabilities, kids who are at risk of dropping out, kids who are not at risk of dropping out. Because we know that the work we do with individual kids is affected by the culture of the larger school. We also know that evidence-based practices have to be organized in a way that we can implement them well. So when you take the final for this particular class, this course, this radio webcast, and somebody says to you, what is school-wide PBS? The most important response is it's a framework or an approach. It's not an intervention. It's not a practice. It's not a curriculum. It's really a way of doing business, which is really what a lot of us do in the prevention world. It's about how we organize our interventions in a way that maximizes its effects. So if you go to the next slide, which has 4 little circles and 3 little circles, 1 big circle, this is how we operate that continuum. Now, the big message I want you to hear from this particular picture is that school-wide PBS is really made up of these 4 critical elements. The practices circle, that one that's at the very bottom, that's the easy one. That's the interventions that we use. It's our social skills programs, our behavioral contracts. It's our instructional strategies. It's our cognitive behavioral counseling approaches. It is those interventions. That's what the kid experiences. What we've learned in our approach is that those practices tend to have decreased effects because we don't pay attention to matching up to the critical outcomes that we're trying to help the kids achieve, which is the big circle, outcomes. Then you ask, of course, well, how do we identify those outcomes to align them with the practices? And that's where the data part comes in. The data have to be used to identify where kids are at, where they need to be, what they do well, what they don't do well, so that we can identify those practices that are going to be the most effective in supporting them. And that's why those circles overlap. That's why it's called integrated. However, the most important circle, which is a little circle, unfortunately, but probably needs to be a big circle, is the system circle, which is where, frankly, we spend about 80% of our time at the center, which is what do we need to put in place to assist the adults to use those practices well so we can achieve the outcomes that the practices promise, so that we can use the data to guide those decisions. So if you put all this together, school-wide PBS, it's a framework for doing business. What's the business? It's about organizing those practices in a continuum based on the data that we have to achieve the outcomes that are the most important for the kids, academic and social, and to organize those systems. I think that's a very important kind of logic to keep in mind because it moves us away from a traditional one-shot in-service model where we find something that's interesting because it's laminated, we bring it into the school, we train, but it may not be sufficient to address a need because the data haven't been looked at or we haven't prepared our faculty to implement that well. So again, if somebody says to you, what is school-wide PBS? You want to respond back saying that it's a framework for doing business around maximizing academic and behavioral outcomes. And it's not just about the tricks or the interventions. It's about organizing them around the data, systems, and most important outcomes. So one more piece, and then I'll stop for a second, give everybody a chance to breathe. And that's the triangle. And I know many of you have seen this triangle before because it's shown up in a lot of places, but I wanted to give you a couple things about it beyond just that it's a multi-tiered logic. So you understand how it fits in the school-wide PBS context, how it actually fits in the dropout prevention logic. The 3-tiered logic comes out of the public health literature, and it's been around for a long time. And it talks about catching kids, adults, before a problem develops or before a problem occurs. Why is that important? It's about prevention. In 1993, Hill Walker, who is probably most famous for some of his antisocial behavior work, working kids with severe aggressive behaviors, said we can apply that public health logic to behavior. And he took the triangle, the 3 tiers, and said let's apply that to schools. In 1996, he and a bunch of other colleagues wrote this very important paper and it described a multi-tiered approach to supporting kids with behavioral difficulties. The center said, this is cool. We want to use that logic to organize how the center does its business. And ever since then, the multi-tiered logic has been used as a way to organize the interventions and the systems that we put in place for school-wide PBS. The basic logic is that everybody inside the school needs to be exposed to, on a regular basis, a primary prevention intervention, something that's good for all kids. What we've learned is that 70 to 80% of those kids do just fine with that school-wide system that's typically in place. But there's about 15 to 20% of students who require a little extra, and they require not more of the same, but they actually require something different, something that's more specialized, something that's more individualized. And I'll come back and describe what those are in a second. But what's important here is that we have this logic of looking at the kids who are unresponsive and then identifying what to do differently for those kids. So let me stop there before we go on with more about the features and the operations. Ask Marty and Terry if they have questions or if there's anybody who might have a question from out in the cyberspace out there.
Well, we're getting bombarded with questions, George, so Terry and I will hold ours and save them for later. But first we've had Jennifer, who's been waiting several minutes now from Wilmington, Massachusetts. So Jennifer, welcome to the program. And do you have a comment or do you have a question for Dr. Sugai?
Well, I teach in a program for students with EBD in a public school setting, and I was wondering if you have any suggestions for using positive behavior supports with those students, even if the rest of the school is not yet buying into it.
Excellent question. My heart's with you because I'm an ex-EBD teacher, so this is an important kind of question for me to look at and for all of us to kind of think about. Let me respond generally first, then I'll answer specifically next. One is that the three-tiered logic applies in any kind of organizational structure. It doesn't matter if it's a high school, a preschool, elementary school, alternative school. The continuum logic is always going to be applied. I think about the university where I teach now. I know that if I do a good job in my courses, 80% of the kids are probably going to get something from that basic instruction. But I know some kids are going to need a little extra tutoring, so I provide some extra materials for them. I know some of the students here will require some more individualized supports. So the continuum logic applies to any time when you have a group of individuals who are trying to be successful within a particular organization or system. Now, having said that, two more points addressing your question. One is, I think it's really important that a program like yours or any program that has a specialized kind of purpose or mission be incorporated into the larger system where it's located. So, for example, in a school I used to teach at in Aurora, Colorado, I ran a program for kids with emotional behavioral disorders. They participated in the social culture of the larger school. They were part of the larger discipline system. They were part of the larger character ed program. They experienced what everybody else experienced. However, we knew that they required more to be successful. So I would provide them with a little extra to be successful within the general curriculum. Now, going to the last part, then I'll stop, is that inside my program, if you will, with the 18 kids that I had, we had our own continuum. We had a level system established that all kids were part of. We had extra behavioral contracting for those kids who needed a little extra. We had a targeted social skills group that was run by a counselor who I worked with inside the special program. So the big message is I would say that the continuum logic applies to any group. And to the greatest extent possible, you want to include all kids in the larger organization to the extent that you can. If I was to go back and start a classroom again just of 18 kids or 12 kids or whatever, for sure, I would say, what can I do for all kids? For the kids who aren't responding to that intervention, what would I do for those kids that would be slightly different, and so forth. So I think your question's right on. You want to organize your systems because we're learning that it's a much more efficient way to go about the process.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, and thank you, Jennifer, for calling. I hope you've left your name and address with Eric so we can get you that publication. Mm-hmm. We have another caller online who's been waiting too, and this is Paula. And Paula's calling from Camden, South Carolina. Paula, you're on the air with Dr. George Sugai. Do you have a question or comment?
Yes, ma'am, I sure do. I'm not in a school setting, but I'm working with a grant program that works with transition and truancy. And my team's working on developing GPS classes, guided parenting strategy classes. And we're just wondering, does PBIS offer strategies that parents can employ and try?
Another great question. You know, when you think about school-wide PBS, you got school-wide that's very prominent. It's probably doesn't capture what we really do, which is it does involve community, it does involve families and parents. Just jumping ahead a little bit, but whenever we set up, quote, the systems that we call PBS, we always start with a team inside the school. That team is made up of an administrator, teacher representatives, and so forth. But we also always require a family member to be on that leadership team to start building, assessing, looking at the school culture. So parents are involved at the get-go on setting up the larger continuum. So that's one answer. The second answer to your question is that we try to take whatever's going on inside the school and make sure that it's transferable to the home, the community, families, and so forth. As an example, one thing some of our schools have done is they've set up, for example, these 3 or 4 kinds of value statements about the building. So something like, let's say, safety, respect, and responsibility. And what they've done then is said, well, we've got to show those on the bus as well as in the classroom, as well as in the hallways, as well as at the dances. And they've helped teach those on the bus, and they've also put together a little lesson plan, if you will, that goes home with the kids for families and parents to be able to remind the kids about what's expected on the bus, what it looks like to wait for the bus, to be safe, respectful, and responsible. And one of our schools, the Parent-Teacher Association, said, how can we help you teach those same values at home? For example, what does respect, responsibility, and safety look like during morning routine, during homework time, during bedtime? How can we teach better ways for kids and family members and parents to apply those same basic skills? They may look differently at home than they would in the cafeteria, but the same value called respect would occur. So the message, I think, is really important. You got to include parents in the implementation of the basic model. You've also got to include some reaching out to parents and communities for the implementation of the practices as well. I think that's an important kind of connection to make.
Okay. I think we've had some really good questions, Terry. Don't you think so?
I think so. Right.
And so, but we will move on now, George, if that's okay, and see what's going on and happen next.
I'd be glad to move on. I'm also excited to hear what all these people are out there. It's neat, though, just to go off task for a second. South Carolina is a state where there is a statewide model in place for implementing PBIS kinds of strategies, incorporating districts. Massachusetts also has started a few pilot demonstrations. So for callers, one thing I think it's important to do if you're interested in knowing what's going on inside your state, check to see if there is a PBIS leadership team in place at the state level or at the district level, because it's likely that we've helped them set up some of that infrastructure to support the implementation, and you can get some direct support locally as well as at the national level. So jumping to the national level, if you look at the slide that has RTI right in the middle, I know that this isn't directly dealing with prevention per se, but it's such an important thing to understand that what we're doing in school-wide PBS, and I would argue what's going on in dropout prevention, is actually linked to what's going on in this other thing happening nationally called response to intervention. Response to intervention has been around for a while. It's been very much focused on the academic side, early literacy, math, high schools as well as elementary. I think it's very important for listeners to understand that RTI also is an umbrella for behavior as well. So let's start off generally. All those features that surround the red RTI on that slide are the features that define RTI: database decision-making, universal screening, continuous progress monitoring, prevention, and so forth. Those are all the features that define good RTI for early literacy, for numeracy, for algebra. It's all the same. Put in place a good curriculum for teaching algebra. make sure we screen all kids to see how they're doing, monitor their progress to see if they're getting the lesson, modify the lesson based on their performance, modify the supports based on their responsiveness. It doesn't really matter, same applications. The reason I'm bringing this up under this particular webcast is because I want people to be clear that RTI is not just the academic, it's actually academic and behavior combined, and it's actually under the same umbrella. If you go to the next slide, there's an attempt there to try to show you that response to intervention is the umbrella for all the content areas, and that PBS is just the behavioral demonstration of RTI logic. I would argue that for good or bad, we've been doing RTI in the center since its inception, because the triangle logic is actually response to intervention. And that's where that came from. So if there's a message that the listener should walk away with is, and again, this applies at the classroom level, as one of your listeners, Jennifer, indicated. It also applies to the context of providing parent training as well. You know, if some family members don't respond to some of the supports that are provided, we don't say that they're bad. We don't give them more of the same. We actually change to accommodate their supports that they need to have. If you go to the next slide, I'm showing this off because in 1996 or so, there was 2 school districts in Oregon who said, well, we can actually put together an academic system and a behavioral system for our school district. They didn't call it response to intervention at the time. They just called it 2 triangles. And then the 2 triangle logic popped up a little bit later. And you see this picture, which has been seen quite a bit because it shows the academic and the behavioral systems combined, side by side. To make it even better, if you go to the next slide, one thing we've tried to do, though, is 2 things. One is to move away from 3 static levels and also talk about academic and behavioral as being combined, that they're not separate. To get there the fast way, what I want you to know is that there's really nothing that says every school should have 3 tiers. We use the 3-tiered logic as strictly that, as a logic for organizing. But we want people to understand that it's a multi-tiered continuum that schools will set up. So as Jennifer mentioned earlier, in an alternative school, you might have 4 or 5 tiers, so to speak. In a general ed classroom where you have kids who are performing more similarly, you may only have 2 tiers. So I think it's better to think about the responsiveness of the kids and the interventions you have available. Now, I want to show you 2 more slides, and I'll do another stop again. And this is a little pet peeve of mine, and because Marty and Terry gave me the opportunity, I'm kind of slipping in a little commercial, if you will. And the commercial is the following, and maybe it's not a commercial as much as a cleanse my past, deal with my guilt. When we first started with the 3 tiers, we ended up inappropriately, and I honestly say inappropriately, labeling kids by tier. We start saying, well, Marty, she is a tier 3 kid. Oh, no, Terry, that he is a tier 2 kid. And that's very inappropriate. As a special educator, I should know better. We should never label people. We should always label behavior. We should always label what people do and match interventions to what they do, not to the person. So, if you look at this slide, this shows a profile, and it shows a profile for Marcus. And I want you to look at this profile carefully because it shows what Marcus does really well: social studies, social skills, basketball. But it also shows what Marcus struggles with: science and math. Marcus actually has to go down to the science lab to get a little extra small group support for science because he can't succeed inside the big lectures happening inside the high school. In math, he actually has a one-on-one tutor in addition to his math class, in addition to his math lecture. He needs tier 3 level supports for math. Is Marcus a tier 1 kid? No. Is Marcus a tier 3 kid? No. He requires tier 3 supports for math. He requires tier 1 supports for social studies. One thing I think the listening audience could do for me is to help the world understand that the goal of PBIS, RTI, is not to label kids and what tier they're at, but it's really to label the kinds of supports that are required. To take it one step further, if you go to the next slide, this is another kid. This kid's name is Manuela. I'm making all this up, by the way, but Manuela. Manuela has a different profile, and this is just her social behavior profile. It looks at just her social competence. And she's a kid who's actually been labeled and might even be in Jennifer's classroom as having emotional behavioral disorders. Why is Manuela in Jennifer's classroom? It's because she has problem-solving anger management issues. And she's having difficulty managing her anger and solving problems at the level of interfering with her academic performance. But guess what? Manuela also has some strengths. She's got good cooperative play skills. She's got good peer interaction skills. She shows up to school on a regular basis. She actually can talk to adults. But she has problems with peers around problem solving and anger management. Is she a Tier 3 kid? No. Does she require Tier 3 supports for problem solving? Absolutely. So one of the things I think is very important about school-wide PBS, which will help us, I think, in how we set up programs, is that we think about matching the interventions to the strengths and challenges that kids have, not to labeling kids, because I think we get in trouble, and we don't want to get into the problem of labeling people. We want to label what they do. Just as a little side commercial, the same thing I think we have to worry about for bully prevention. We're going down a dangerous road, I believe, of labeling kids as bullies, labeling kids as victims, labeling kids as contributors or bystanders, perpetrators, and so forth. And I'm worried that we're going to go down and start labeling kids and actually starting stereotyping those kids based on their label, when in fact they have some strengths, they have some things that we can work with, but they also have some challenges. We probably won't get there, but what I worry about is that we're going to end up having a DSM-7 category called bullying. And we don't want to go down the route of trying to diagnose a category, but instead saying we've got these kids who engage in bullying behavior that actually interferes with their ability to interact with other kids, and we need to help them be more successful in learning how to play more cooperatively or what have you. Okay, so just backtrack just a second. School-wide PBS is this framework for organizing the interventions that go inside that blended continuum. The interventions are going to match up to what the skills are that the kid displays. And then from there, we say, what are the interventions that we want to put in place? And we always base it on the data about how the kid's responding. So let me stop there.
Okay, well, since we're talking about interventions, I have one question. I think that Terry may have one as well, but mine came from South Dakota, so I just had to take it, okay? And this is from Penny. She sent something on email, and she says, good afternoon, and would you please tell me how Check and Connect works, which I think is an evidence-based intervention. Maybe you could talk about that for a minute, George?
Yeah. So let me speak broadly first and then intervention specifically. There are a number of well-defined kind of programs or interventions. Check and Connect is one of those. It's one in which it has a very specific kind of purpose. It's intended to try to increase the amount of contacts between kids and adults. It increases the amount of feedback kids get. It increases the amount of interactions between and so forth and so on. What we like to think about is how the interventions and these programs fit into the continuum, which kids, if you will, and their strengths and challenges are going to be best met by those interventions. So let me just kind of take that question then and shift it to the next slide.
Okay.
And if you look at that slide then, what this is just an example. So those of you that are taking notes, put a big circle around example. This is not what everybody should do. It's just an example. My wife is a school principal. If I was to walk into her school and I said to her, what does your continuum of supports look like? And she would say to me, at the primary tier level, what all kids experience is that we teach them a set of expectations about what we value inside the school. We have a proactive school-wide discipline system. We acknowledge kids when they're doing a good job. We have the best academic interventions possible, and we involve parents. And then she says, there are some kids who need more, and they require a little extra. And then she says, well, what are the interventions we have in place? We have a strategy called Check and Check Out. Our school counselor has a peer-based support system. We have a social skills club, et cetera, et cetera. And then she says, for the individual kids who need more, we have function-based support. We have a wraparound system and process in place, and we organize our planning and intervention systems around person-centered, family-involved, et cetera. Now, going back to the question about Check and Connect, the question becomes one of, who's the intervention for? Is it for all kids? Is it for a few? Is it for individual students? Check and Connect is a program out of Minnesota. It's a great intervention. It's an evidence-based system. It's one that's put in place for all kids because everybody's involved in it at some level. But it targets some kids who need a little extra because of their need to improve attendance or whatever the target goal is. So again, the way I'd answer that is, ask yourself where it fits into the continuum. What are its critical features? What kinds of behaviors and what kinds of kids will benefit from it? And how is it integrated into all the interventions that are in place?
Okay.
So let me stop there and see if that answers Penny's question.
Well, we hope so because she's on email. And
that's right.
Hopefully, Penny, that answers your question, and we appreciate you sending it to us. Now, my colleague has a question.
George, I'd like to talk a little bit about your model here and how the implementation might differ at the elementary versus the secondary level, and what are some of the challenges pertinent to each school level as you've addressed some of those logistics of making that happen?
I think this is a setup. Terry gets all the hard questions, right? All right. Excellent question. Comes up frequently, and it's one that people need to understand because I think it's a very important thing to kind of move implementation forward. The short answer is that we really present school-wide PBS or PBIS as a framework for doing business, and there are some operational principles, PLESs, behind it that make it work, like data systems and evidence-based practices and teach what you want and acknowledge what you see and so forth and so on. Those general principles are are applicable across the grade levels. High school, middle, elementary, preschool. We're always going to acknowledge kids. We're always going to make sure that we teach them what the expectations are, be it a syllabus for an algebra class, be it what sportspersonship looks like at a game, what appropriate social behaviors look like at a dance, or what does it look like at morning circle at the preschool? What does it look like for advisory at the middle school or homeroom? It's all about teaching what we want for successful social cultures to be established. How it's taught, specifically the content, might vary based on the level. In addition, as the kids get older, as their social competence builds, they're also going to be more involved. We really encourage, for example, at the high school level, that high school kids be participants, active participants. Joanne Malloy's work up in New Hampshire and stuff she's doing in other states about involving kids is really essential at the high school level because participation and engagement increases their buy-in, increases their involvement and acceptability of the interventions that are being put forth. It's also true at the middle school, having kid involvement because they're still testing their relationships with the adults. They're building that interpersonal skills. We want kids to be involved. So again, as you want to involve kids, involve family members, involve community members, at the high school, middle school, some of the issues we're dealing with here in Connecticut mean we want to involve school resource officers. It might mean that we want to involve local businesses based on where the neighborhood is, what the locations are. Another way to take your question, Terry, and spin it another way is to look at the local cultures, and how do we adapt the intervention for a school that might be in South Dakota on an Indian reservation? What would it look like in an urban community, environment like Boston and Massachusetts? What would it look like in a rural community in Nebraska? Those variations are going to modify what the interventions would look like, but the interventions would be similar in what their common features are.
Okay, well, thank you so much, George. That was great.
Yeah, I think, why don't we move on now to the next slide and the next part of the program?
Good. Well, I'll take Terry's question then to build on the next slide, which is all those blue circles. Mm-hmm. The intervention question is a good one because what we didn't want to do at the center is to be one place where you just see hundreds and 200, 3,000 strategies. We wanted to organize them in a way that would be available to the consumer to make good decisions. So the blue slide represents how we've organized the practices, and they've organized around 5 domains. School-wide, which is all kids, all classrooms, all settings, all staff. classroom, which is where instruction goes on, non-classroom settings, which are where instruction isn't happening, which are hallways, cafeteria, buses, parking lots, field trips. Student, which means Tier 2, Tier 3, individual kid supports, and family, which is what our listener asked about earlier. How do we involve and incorporate family involvement in the process? Now, instead of loading up those circles, what we tried to do is say, what is the smallest number of interventions that are evidence-based that can have the biggest and most durable effect? More is not better when we talk about trying to improve the social culture of a school. It's about making sure that we have the biggest effect with the smallest number of interventions possible. Because, frankly, in schools, we just don't have the time, the minutes to do as many things as possible. We want to pick those that have the biggest likelihood of having an effect. So if you go to your next slide, and this is on purpose, some of you are squinting right now, I know you are. There are 5 to 10 interventions or practices that have been placed under each of those categories. What we've tried to do is not necessarily put named interventions in there. There's not a commercial products. But what there are some, what we like to call evidence-based best practices for each of those domains. So if I was to be a school principal tomorrow and I was to set up a new school, I would want to make sure that every classroom teacher did those 5 or 6 elements in their classroom. I'd want to make sure that our staff as a whole, under school-wide, did those 6 or 7 features. I'd want to make sure under non-classroom settings that whenever a teacher, a security officer, or a custodian is walking in the hallway, that they did those 4 or 5 items. Because what do those represent from the literature? The smallest number of things we can do to have the biggest effect. Will it help all kids? Probably not. What it will do, we think, is address most of the kids in those environments. Because when you go to the bottom left-hand corner, we've got these individual kids who need more than just active supervision, who need more than just 3 school-wide rules. And so what we've tried to do is say, if you're going to do nothing else, do at least these things. The most important thing to look at when you look at those lists is that there's nothing there that emphasizes sort of the reactive stuff. You're not going to see in-school suspension, in-school detention. Not that they are not structures that we want to have in place, but we know that they're not the most effective strategies by themselves. So we've tried to emphasize the preventative, positive features of what should be in place inside of schools. Just to do one more piece, and then I'll stop again. If you go to the next slide, I think this notion about evidence-based is what all of us need to be very clear about. Evidence-based means that we have some kind of information that gives us confidence that an intervention is likely to work. If you look at that slide, at the top 2 ovals, that's research. In my world of research, what I do when I do studies, I try to do those 2 top circles. I try to figure out what works and when does it work. Does it work only at the high school? Does it only work with little kids? Does it only work with kids with size 7 shoes? Tell me about the intervention. And then when I hand it over to my wife, who's a principal, she's going to worry about the practice and sustained implementation of good practice. What does that require? It requires monitoring and implementation. So those of you that are out there listening, if you're a researcher or if you're involved in adopting a practice, you want to pay attention to what the evidence is on around efficacy and effectiveness. If you are using Jennifer as the example, a classroom teacher or a team member or somebody who's going to take that practice and put it in place with kids and families, then we want to focus on, are we doing what the intervention says we're supposed to be doing, and is it producing the outcomes that we want? This picture, which comes out of the Wing Institute in California by Ronnie Dietrich and others, it really does a nice job of showing the relationship between evidence-based practice and how we put it in place and what we need to emphasize. So those of you that are in schools right now, your job is to implement with fidelity so that you can sustain the outcomes. Those of you that are in the process of adoption, you got to pay attention to what the research says. So let me stop there.
Yeah, and we did have an email question earlier that I've been kind of holding to the right moment. And I think when you mentioned research and you've gone through this whole explanation about the tiers, and that important foundational school climate tier, I think this next question can be kind of an interesting one, because we have many of our listeners in the dropout prevention world are at alternative schools, and particularly alternative high schools. And so Celia from, again, we got a group here in Camden, South Carolina. She's asking if there's been some effective implementation of PBIS in alternative high schools, and maybe you could tell what happened there, because I'm imagining that bottom tier, the green one, is maybe smaller for a school like that. Could you share some research or other stories about that?
So two ways to organize that. One is there's not a lot of research in alternative high schools. There is some research on alternative schools. So we know that the continuum logic is applicable to alternative settings. Again, it's going to look differently, like I mentioned earlier.
Right.
The research isn't as deep as it is for some of the more general ed settings and whatnot. For alternative high schools, we have some evidence at the demonstration level, maybe not as much at the evidence level. Now, that's just what I know. There may be others out there, and there's probably researchers out there saying, well, I have a study that. So I need to be careful in saying, that I'm only reflecting on what I know, which is pretty limited in some ways. So if you were to say to me, should we do this in alternative high schools? I say, absolutely, the logic applies. Is there good research to back it up? I'd say, we think so. We don't have specific examples, or I'm not aware of specific examples of how that might be applied on the PBIS content. But if you said, can you direct me to some high schools, alternative high schools, where that's being applied? I'd say absolutely. Go to the state of Maryland, where they've got high school implementation in place. Go to Illinois, where there's high school implementation going on. And there's some examples with good local evidence of things like decreases in in-school detentions, decrease in the use of restraints, for example. No, restraints is not a good word, but good use of more restrictive kinds of consequences in these alternative settings, decreased uses of restrictive placements and so forth as ways to talk about it. It's probably not a very satisfying answer because we don't have a big body of research. Those of you that are researchers, you can become rich and famous by taking that on, because I think that's something where we don't know as much about.
Well, it would certainly be an interesting area to pursue, because logically it would make sense. I think, Terry, all these alternative schools we've gone to, where, again, that foundation of school climate is strong, has shown that these are good schools. The kids are doing well. So
good.
I think the logic is there. We don't have a caller right now, so why don't we move on? Okay.
Just for the sake of time, I'm going to do one more, the next slide, and then I'm going to skip over a couple slides. All this research to practice stuff is, replications and efficacy. Those are all interesting things to talk about. When we talk about the PBS work that we do, we really push hard for making it simple. And this picture is the logic we apply to saying, let's make it simple in trying to select an intervention. Let's make it simple with respect to evaluating what we're currently doing. Let's make it simple with respect to whether or not we want to change or not. And the simple means, what are the 4 or 5 things that we always want to look for when we want to judge whether or not something is working or not? And it could say, is this alternative school working or not? Or is this particular intervention with Manuela working well or not? And they are the following. One is there any evidence out there that I can trust this thing, that it has some possibility of working, which is the effectiveness question. The next one, which I think is really important, which is efficiency. Can real people do the intervention? There are some really neat evidence-based practices out there that are very complicated to implement, or that require high-intensity kind of professional development to put in place. We've got to ask that question, do we really have the capacity to put some of these interventions in place so they can have the effect as promised from the research? So is this really doable? It can be evidence-based, but it's not doable by the environments in which it's required. We're in trouble. Third one is it contextually and culturally relevant? We've got to pay attention to the local culture, be it ethnic, racial, linguistic, whatever. We've got to be paying attention to what are the learning histories of the people who come to these schools, and we've got to adapt it to that context. Fourth, it's got to last longer than the 90-day warranty. If the intervention isn't something we can trust for more than 90 days or whatever, past the school year, it's probably not worth the investment. We've got to have something that we know will have durable effects and can be something that will be implemented for over time. And the last one is, it's great if it works in classroom 7, but if it doesn't work in classroom 10, we're not going to be effective. If it doesn't work in 9th grade and transfer up to 10th grade, we got to judge whether or not it's something we want to invest in. I think if we do a good job looking at interventions across those 5 categories, we're going to make better implementation decisions so that we can maximize our outcomes. Just a little side note, and then I'll stop again, around this efficiency question. One of the things that troubles me is that we do not apply the RTI logic to schools. What I mean by that is we should be saying to ourselves, if a school doesn't respond to a professional development experience by putting it in place, by producing the outcomes we want, we should probably be saying, let's change the professional development experience, maybe change the intervention or supports we provide the school, not give the school more to do. The short story is that schools that are in trouble in our PBS, school-wide PBS work, we're finding that they have a difficult time putting school-wide PBS in place because they have 16 other mandates to put in place at the same time. The problem is that we have schools that are the most in trouble being asked to do more than even the schools that are doing well are being asked to do. They probably don't have the capacity to do 16 mandates or initiatives at the same time. We should be applying the RTI logic to schools. What do all schools need to have to be successful? What do some schools need to have to be successful? And what do a few schools need to have, i.e. school reform schools? And how can we put in place an action plan for those schools that's very strategic? Instead of doing 17 things, what are the top 3 things that a school can do? Literacy, behavior, parent engagement. And stick to it. Mm-hmm. Because what we're finding is that we're asking schools to do way more than they can do, and they fail at all because they're spread so thin.
Spread so thin. Well, we have another caller, George, and I want to be able to be responsive to those who do make the effort to call. So we have Michelle, who's from LaGrange, Georgia. Michelle, you are on the air with Dr. George Sugai, and I hope you have a question or comment to share.
Good afternoon. Yes, I have a question regarding the research-based practices. How do you go about finding which ones are the strongest as far as research-based, or how long should you try a program to find out that you're getting the maximum out of it?
Great. 2 ways to answer that. Good question, Michelle. One is there are a number of places you can look, like the What Works Clearinghouse that the Department of Education supports. You can go to the SAMs of the mental health websites and look at those that are research evidence-based practices that are recommended by the research community. Be aware that those sites apply the strictest kinds of evidence-based criteria to selecting those interventions. So then you say, well, what about those that have some evidence of effectiveness but don't meet the gold standards of randomized control trials? Then you start saying, well, where do I go to look for that content? One thing we'd recommend then is to start going, and the web is great, just going to different centers like the Dropout Prevention Center, like our center, like the RTI Center, and other centers that are out there, because what they've done is said, let's talk about the evidence base that goes from descriptive to quasi-experimental to single subject to randomized control or whatever. And they've said, let's look at the total body of evidence and make recommendations about maybe not best practice, but possibly promising practices. The reason that we and they have done that is because if you only stuck to those that were the gold standard practices, which we should start with, we may not have practices that cover all the challenges that are presenting inside of schools, and we want to go to the other practices. That goes to your second question, which is how do you know when to punt? And the general rule that I like to apply is the 1-3-7-9 rule, which says try an intervention. After 1 day, check to see how it's going. After 3 days, check to see how it's going. After 5 days, check. Why so many checks at the beginning? Because we typically will know whether or not the intervention is being implemented with fidelity and if the kids are being responsive to that intervention within the first week, 2 weeks of the implementation practice. Frankly, it's there to check to see if it's being implemented with fidelity. The reason why we like to recommend early decision-making about the effectiveness of a practice at kid outcome and implementation fidelity is because, not in Georgia, but other states, we have schools that implement and they wait until the end of the semester to check to see if it's working or not. And by then, it's too late because it actually had failed after the first week, because it was the wrong intervention, because it wasn't being implemented with fidelity, or because the outcomes at the kid level weren't being produced at a sufficient level. So your question is really right on, and it is all about, what level of evidence do you need to have to make a decision? If you make a decision based on evidence that isn't as high quality as you'd like it to be, it means you've got to be much more diligent about watching the implementation as it goes. I'd probably recommend be careful about those that don't have anything beyond just testimonials. You want to go with those at least that have, some way of saying this is where we started and this is where we ended up. Regardless, the goal is to focus on implementation fidelity.
Yeah, George, I'd like to follow up on that with Michelle's question, and you mentioned this. The National Dropout Prevention Center on our website, dropoutprevention.org, has a model program database, and it gives the level of research behind each of those model programs, it might be a good place to look if you haven't looked there as yet.
Right. And that's really good. I think the extent to which centers like yours or the Dropout Prevention Center and others can help consumers look for the solution, a really good idea, because it's so easy to go to a website, see something that is, as I kidded before, laminated and organized by day, but not have sufficient evidence to back up the adoption of that practice.
I have a quick question here from Jan in Florida, and her question is this. We offer on-site at-school mental health counseling as an intervention for students needing mental health, case management, crisis intervention services. What data could we use to show the effectiveness of this particular intervention?
When you say intervention, you mean the total package?
It looks like she's looking at that specific intervention within the context of everything I'm guessing there. And again, this is email.
Right. So let me answer broadly again, like I like to do, and then try to answer specifically. One is I think it's a good idea to build a comprehensive school with respect to behavioral and mental health supports. I think that's a smart way to go. I always like to think of schools as being the best place for all kids and families to get many of their social and behavioral and mental health needs met. There's a school in every neighborhood. There's adults there who can assist every kid. Every kid gets exposed to, in general, to positive role models. It's a safe place to get food. It's one of the best places for prevention if you think about it. And I think it is a good place to make available mental health supports to kids and families and, within that, particularly in the neighborhood. So I think that's a smart way to go. The evidence base for that, I don't know as well. So I have to fudge on that one. I do know that the comprehensive school models have been widely, kind of promoted, and I think they make good sense. I just don't know what that literature says. I know there's some literature on kind of neighborhood, drop-in centers that talk about its effectiveness in supporting kids, and I think what's common about all those is they're kind of proactive and they're built into the logic of the building. To get specific, though, if I was working in a school and I knew that I had access to that kind of a service, meaning kind of mental health services, I would really want to build that into the larger continuum. One of the mistakes I think we have in schools is that the school counselors, mental health specialists get locked into come to my office at 9 o'clock for your appointment. Mm-hmm. And I really think that social workers, for example, can actually serve all kids as a prevention piece of it. I think school psychologists can actually work with all classroom teachers as a way to build in good prevention strategies. I think good speech and language is actually something that could be done with all kids, not only for screening, but also for, so I think there's this way that we should be thinking about our resources as being part of the whole continuum. One way I like to think about this is I'm a special educator by training, but what I do now is I work with all kids and all staff across all settings with the opportunities to work with individual kids. But I think the idea of mental health supports inside of schools is a wonderful one, and I'd say let's think about how you can build it into the continuum.
I think that's a great question and great answer. And we're going to take one more call before we move on. But as you know, I like to respond to these calls. They're always fun. We have Melinda calling from the Bronx. That's the first place I live, Melinda. So I had to take your call long time ago. But welcome to the program, and do share your question or comment for Dr. Sugai.
Well, first of all, I am a social worker, so it's really nice to hear about social workers being used in prevention, because I'm a firm believer in that. I was really happy to hear you acknowledge how difficult it is with a million different mandates for schools to collect data, and that's a major concern of mine, because I see when it comes to behavior lately, teachers are being asked more and more to measure outcomes, and it's one thing to be able to measure amount of suspensions on the school level, but if it's measuring, I work with emotionally disturbed children, and children with autism, and if it's measuring how many times a child is getting out of his or her seat or not being attentive, it becomes so difficult to gather the data, and everything seems to be measurable. And, everything is the concern is its effectiveness and how to measure it, and data-based and evidence-based. But in order for teachers to do that, it's extremely, extremely time-consuming. Do you have any suggestions?
Sure. The question's right on, and I'm going to go back to my safety kind of principles, if you will. And we think about data in the same way we think about interventions, which is along that continuum. What do we want to collect on all kids to get a sense about how successful they are? What do we want to collect on individual kids that are having, so forth? So how do we kind of think about data collection along that continuum? Unfortunately, what you're describing is a challenge we all have, which is the more intensive the challenge a kid presents, sometimes we have to collect more frequent data. But there are some guidelines that I think we can use to make that better. And I don't know how to do this exactly, but if you go to the slide that says data decision making on it, there are some guidelines there and about how to make sure we set up data systems that don't become too intrusive. As you're looking at those guidelines, let me give you some things to think about. At the school-wide level, we've always said go with what is already there, which is one of the reasons we use office discipline referrals, because it's part of the typical discipline structure of a school. It's also what schools keep track of. It's also what districts pay attention to. We don't add any new data systems. We go with what you got. Now, to believe in it, though, you've got to make sure that it is being collected well, easily accessible, and so forth. So those things have to be put in place. Now, to go more directly to your question, though, one thing we're learning is that sometimes we're collecting data just for collecting data's sake. And one thing we do at the individual kid level or small group levels, we always start out by saying, what's the number one question we want to answer for a given student? And then we set up a data system to answer that question. If we're collecting data and it doesn't help us answer a question that helps us to determine the effectiveness of an intervention or whatnot, it's probably not worth collecting. And in fact, it becomes aversive, and people get kind of angry about it and they don't want to do it. So what we've tried to do is say, we know that Manuela has autism. We know that Manuela has a lot of issues. We know that you want to collect a lot for each of her challenges. But what are the top two that we want to keep track of on a daily basis? And that what do we want to sample for the rest of those? Or what do we want to use as an indirect measure of how well they're doing? One of my colleagues here, Sandy Shafoulias, who's in school psychology, has been doing some research on something called a daily behavior rating process, which is sort of like a curriculum-based measurement structure for looking at social behavior. And her initial research indicates that it is possible to get fairly good data by taking kind of global measures of kid performance based on teacher perception and be able to make some decisions about intervention effectiveness, at least on a general level. And so that's very promising for us. But I think to answer your question, it's really about helping the people who are setting up the data systems to have good guiding rules about what they're asking people to do. What's the smallest number of questions we want to have answered? How frequently do we have to take the data to be able to answer that question? What are some things that we can take on a sampling basis and still produce the right outcomes?
Okay.
So how's that sound, Melinda?
Good.
Right. Well, we appreciate your calling in, and make sure you leave your name and address with Eric. And, hey, let's move on, George. Time's wasted here. We've got so much more to learn.
Okay. Just a couple more things then I want to do. And that is, if you skip forward to the slide that says seven big ideas.
Okay.
I just want to kind of finish off with those.
That's about 4 or 5 slides ahead, listeners.
Yeah, or 2 or 3 towards the third from the end, I think.
Yeah, okay.
And I just want to quickly go through these. And I know that it's starting to get dark here. My stomach's starting to growl a little bit. So I know that we should close out. So let's kind of organize this in the following way. If you had to walk away with 7 take-home messages, what would they be? If you had to think of school-wide behavioral support, and if you had to characterize something that's important about it, these are some things that I ask you to think about. And I think, and Terry can correct me if I'm wrong, these are probably 7 things that probably make sense from a dropout prevention perspective as well.
Exactly.
One is, this whole problem of responding to dropouts, responding to bullying, responding to problem behavior. That's great to respond to it, but the really investment is how to prevent it from occurring in the first place, how to prevent it from being developed in the first place. And I think that's what our big investment is. Pre-correction means let's catch it before it occurs, because it's going to happen. We have too many schools who wait for a kid to mess up and then do something. And they say, well, we'll teach him after he does it. And we're going to say, he's going to do it. What can you do before it happens to prevent it from happening in the first place? Jeff Colvin, Doug Carnine, Ziggy Engelman have taught us this concept of pre-correct, which is teach it before the kid makes a mistake. If a kid continually says 7 times 7 is equal to 77, and every time I say, what does 7 times 7 mean equal, he says 77, instead I'm going to stop the kid and say, I'm going to ask you a question, and the question is going to be, what's 7 times 7? The answer is 49. What is 7 times 7? 49. And then we ask the question. We want to catch it before it occurs. We want to teach the right way. We need to do the same thing if we go to an assembly, and I know that Manuela is going to have a blowout at assembly. I want to catch her before she goes to assembly and have her pair up with a kid who can be successful. I want to catch her before she goes to assembly and teach her the right way. So I think one of the things that we do in the prevention world is not only preventing the development, but also catching it before it occurs again. Going through the remaining 6 the fast way, you got to teach these kids what we want them to do. We got to remind them prompt before when it's required, and we got to acknowledge them when it happens. We do a really good job of acknowledging kids when they mess up. We probably need to acknowledge and recognize them more when they do a good job. Number 3, beat this up already. Invest in things that you have some evidence to support their adoption. 4th, pay attention to the context in which it's occurring. Is it cafeteria? Is it hallway? Is it in a community where a majority of the individuals come from a particular culture? Is it a school like my wife where Spanish is a primary language? Tell me about the context in which it's being applied. And evidence-based practice is only as good, number 5, as the accuracy with which it's implemented. And so we got to pay attention to how well we do over time as well as initially. I'm a data guy, want to keep track of the information. Those of you that watch the Super Bowl, you are data-based to death. We rely on data to understand what's going on and to make decisions. We should probably be doing the same thing in the world of behavior. And last one is, the practices are only as good as the systems that are there to support the adults that implement. So to finish off, if you go to the second to the last slide, school-wide PBS, school-wide positive behavioral supports, positive behavioral intervention supports, whatever you want to call it, the Dropout Prevention Center, the RTI Center, all those groups are all about changing how the culture of the school operates so that we can maximize academic and social behavior outcomes. What are we trying to change? We're trying to change three things. We're trying to create environments, organizations, climates, cultures that have a common vision about where we want to go. We want to create this vision in a context in which everybody has a common language by which they are communicating, interacting, relating with each other to get to those values. And lastly, we want everybody inside that school, that classroom, that community to have a common experience, a common set of routines, expectations that operationalizes that language, that actually drives them towards those values or that vision. That kind of logic is what successful businesses are about. It's what successful organizations are about. Probably should be about what successful schools are about. And those three came from my colleague, Rob Horner, who I co-direct the National Center with. And he really likes to push those three, which I think is right on, about successful classroom, successful parent-school relations, successful organizations. So if you go to the last slide, just a little bit of where do you want to go next with this stuff. If you were not satisfied with any of the answers I gave, or if you want more information, go to PBIS.org, because that's where all the PBIS Center content is. I work at the CBER.org site, which is located at the University of Connecticut. And if you really want the right answers, you can talk to Terry and Marty, and they will give you all the right answers for all your questions.
I do want to say, because we've not been able to take all the calls and not been able to answer all the emails, which is exciting in one regard, but disappointing for those who did not get their opportunity. Send any phoned questions to ndpc@clemson.edu and put solutions in the subject line, and we'll do our best to address those questions.
Well, George, you've certainly provided our listeners with an excellent introduction to the PBIS model, and with resources on the websites and lots of opportunity to follow up after the broadcast and et cetera. It's been a wonderfully informative program today, and there are so many other areas we could explore. However, unfortunately, we're at the end of our time, and we really appreciate your taking the time to be with us and our listeners today. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it. It's been fun. I really enjoyed the conversations, and you all did a great job of organizing us.
Well, and I think, as always, I've learned so much during the past hour plus, and I want to thank particularly our listeners today. They have been very active, and we couldn't even meet all their needs, but they make the program even more special than it already was. But I also want to add my thanks to you, George, for being so wonderful to work with during the entire process. So thank you so much. We want to remind our listeners that this radio webcast, like all our monthly programs, will be archived on the website within the next 2 hours, and it will be downloadable for your iPod or your MP3 players, so you can go back and listen to it again and again. And recommend that friends and colleagues listen and learn, and even use the archive program as well as slides and the resources for a professional development activity for an entire faculty or community group. They're certainly the heart and soul of good staff development in this last hour or so. So we encourage you to look into that. And I also want to mention that we're available on iTunes, and you can subscribe to it every month.
Well, next month we're pleased that the Snowed Out program on project-based learning with Angela Wall and her student Bernard Green will at last take place.
Yes.
We're excited about that. So some of you are still getting snow. So at any rate, so mark your calendar for 1 month from today, Tuesday, March the 8th, 2011 at 3:30 Eastern Time for the next Solutions broadcast. Well, we want to thanks to all of you for listening and participating. Remember that we know why students are dropping out of school, and with research-based solutions, we can assure that all of our students graduate. Join us next time for more Solutions to the Dropout Crisis.